Welcome, everybody. Good morning, and welcome to the Carey Institute Scientific Seminar Series. For those of you who are joining us for the first time or from somewhere exotic, interesting, not Millbrook, please let us know where you're tuning in from using the chat page. And please, everyone, use that chat dialogue for logistics and such dialogue, but put any questions you might have for our speaker in the Q&A, where we'll address the questions at the end of her talk as time permits, but we'll also share that list of questions with her. So we really want to try and keep those together in the Q&A tab. As you can see on the slide that's up right now, we still have more seminars coming in the next several Thursdays, including Dr. Casey Cushman next week, who will talk to us about forest ecology and drone remote sensing. So please join us again next week. And then without further ado, I would like to introduce today's speaker, who very grateful for working with us to join us from where she is in Mexico. Dr. Veronica Zamora is a biologist and ecological researcher with the National System of Researchers in Mexico and is at the Instituto Politécnico Nacional of Durango, Mexico, and also holds a visiting academic position with the Center for Biological Sciences at University of Southampton in the UK, not far from where she completed her PhD work at the University of Cambridge and University College London. Her research is and has been integral to understanding and conserving the biodiversity and biodiverse ecosystems in Mexico and across many political borders. Notably, Dr. Zamora approaches ecology and her study of bats in particular with a keen ecosystem perspective and investigates the complexity of the animal-plant interactions and their future impacts on biodiversity in light of changing climate and human land use. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Zamora, who will tell us more about what she's been up to. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you so much, Shannon, for the introduction. I'm very happy and excited to share this piece of my research with all of you. I hope you enjoy it. And now I'm going to share my screen. And I hope you can see it. So one sec, I'm gonna start my chronometer. So today I'm gonna talk a little bit about one area of my research that includes the interaction between pollinating bats and plants and how this system is vulnerable to environmental changes, named climate change and land use change. So I'm gonna talk a little bit about Mexico for those of you that are not familiar with the country. Mexico is cataloged as one of the megadiverse countries worldwide. These countries host a big portion of the worldwide biodiversity in a small area. And here in the map, you can see all the hotspots and megadiverse countries around the world. And here it's positioned Mexico. It holds the 4th place in mammal richness. And in particular, it holds the 5th place.
Excuse me. Sorry, Veronica, we're not seeing your slides advance and it's not in a
it's not in a full screen there.
Oh, okay.
And it didn't go to a slide presentation view.
No. No.
No. So it went to the map, but it's still not in a presentation view.
Sorry. Can you see the presentation?
We can see the presentation,
Okay.
and it's on the map slide.
Okay.
Can
you see the bats now? No.
We see the map, but we also see like your notes, and if you did you try slideshow?
Yeah. Oh.
Veronica,
Okay,
also I can share the slides if you prefer, and then you can just tell me to advance. Oh,
That's
there you
perfect.
go.
It's on the bat.
I guess. Okay, so I'm going to change back and see if it changes. Yeah. Did you see the change? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for this. Okay, so for those who didn't see it, the map of the hotspots around the world, and here you can see Mexico, one of the main hotspots in the continent America. And Mexico also holds the 5th place in bat richness with 140 species. And I wanted to show you this picture so you see all the huge diversity of forms of bats, and you see all the colors and even shapes and almost flavors. And these great differences in the shapes and morphology of bats translates also in important ecosystem services that they provide to all of us humans. You have bats that feed on nectar and they are important pollinators. You have bats that feed on insects and they are important suppressors of insect populations. You have also frugivore bats that they disperse seeds and they regenerate different types of vegetation. And you have even bats that feed on other animals. They are carnivores. So bats are one of the most important not domesticated mammals in terms of the ecological services they provide. And in most of the studies have been focusing on the ecosystem services of insectivorous bats because they are important for worldwide crops like cotton, corn, and they feed on the main pest of these agricultural systems. But almost none of the studies based on the ecosystem services provided by bats focus on pollinating bats. And animal pollination is also one of the most important ecosystem services because 90% of the flowering paths of the flowering plants depend on animal pollination. And some of these plants represent up to 70% of the plant richness in some ecosystems. So without animals, we can completely, some ecosystems will completely disappear. So animal pollination is a very, very important service for us humans. And that is why my research focused on this important interaction between pollinating bats and the plants they pollinate. So there is a particular syndrome in some plants that they tell us that they are pollinated by bats. And this is named Chiropterophily. And here in the slide, you can see the pictures of some of these plants that prefer to be pollinated by bats. For example, you have the family Bombaceae, you have the Passiflora plants, all the columnar cacti, and the agaves from the Agabaceae family. If you can see the characteristics that these plants share is that they are big flowers or they come in huge aggregations. They produce a lot of nectar and they produce a smell that is named almizcle. And they don't have any color because bats cannot distinguish like red colors compared to hummingbirds. But also the pollinated bats have particular characteristics so they can feed on nectar. Most of the pollinating bats here in the continent America, they belong to the family Philostomidae, the subfamily Glossophaginae. And here you can see some pictures of these bats. And you can see they have big eyes and they have an elongated snout so they can go inside the flower. And here you can see the picture of the tongue. They also have a very, very long tongue with papilla at the end so they can extract more nectar from the flowers. So you can see that plants and bats, they have a nice mutualistic evolution so they can benefit from the interaction. Bats are very important for the plants they pollinate because they facilitate the reproductive success of these plants. Bats compared to birds like hummingbirds, they move very long distances. There are some studies that they found that from the roost site to the feeding sites, bats can fly up to 100 or 200 kilometers in one night just to feed. So you can imagine the transportation of the pollen they make, and they maintain the connectivity of metapopulations of these plants. Yeah? And they link isolated habitats also to maintain the regeneration of these habitats where they feed on. Bats are the main pollinators of two very important group of plants. They are important for the ecosystems, and they are very important in terms of economy and the culture of many areas here in Mexico and also in other countries in Latin America. We have the pitayas. The pitayas is the fruit of a columnar cacti. We can see it here in the left. It's a columnar cacti from the genus Stenocereus. It's very important for local communities because they completely depend on the commercialization for income, and they are usually poor localities. And these plants cannot auto-pollinate, so they completely depend on animal pollination for their reproduction. Then you have other group of plants, the agaves, and I'm sure you'll hear about the tequila and mezcal, which is a brand from Mexico. So it's a very, very important group of plants here in the country, and it also provides huge economical incomes for Mexico and other areas. And although tequila, the tequila industry does not depend on the flowering of the plants, the mezcal, which is another type of tequila, it comes from wild plants. So this industry still depends on the pollination and the maintenance of these plant populations in the wild. Yeah, but unfortunately, we're facing also a huge biodiversity crisis worldwide, and even some scientists say we're already facing the 6th mass extinction caused by humans, and they even call our area the Anthropocene. And this extinction is also directed to some groups, some locations, some particular animals, and some particular plants. So some taxa, some species are suffering more than others, and we have to be, well, very scared of what's happening nowadays with this biodiversity crisis. Here, for example, I'm showing you a map of the population declines in mammals worldwide, and you can see that some tropical areas, for example, in Mesoamerica, are projected to have a huge loss of mammals, and you can even see here that some areas of Mexico are worryingly that they are going to lose a lot of mammals. The major threats and drivers of this biodiversity crisis, well, I think are not a shock or a secret for all of us. Here you can see historical trends of some drivers of change. You can see, for example, that in the past, fire was not a threat, but nowadays it's an important threat. Also, anthropogenic climate change is becoming a current trend that historically was not a problem. Also, clearing of the land from agriculture and forests is also a current problem that was not present in the past. So we can say that today, current climate change, habitat change, our exploitation of resources are one of the main threats for all biodiversity worldwide. Here, this map, I put it here so you can see which is the projection for Mexico in terms of climate change. The darker the color, it means that climate change is going to affect more these areas. So you can see here Mexico that is pretty much red. So Mexico is projected to suffer a lot from droughts and increase in climate, and also more events, drastic events like hurricanes, flooding, etc. Also, land use is projected to cause a big change in Mexico from natural areas to anthropogenic covers. Here you can see a map of some of the main vegetations in Mexico. We have temperate forests here along the main mountain ranges. Then all these yellow area are shrublands or arid regions. And the areas in red, you see that the original vegetation was completely wiped out and converted to agriculture or grazing. So big areas already are deforested, and the trend is going to go even worse in the future. And for bats, well, the picture is not promising. Bats are in high danger worldwide. 80% of the species around the world require either conservation or research attention because we don't know a lot about the ecology or the population trends of many bat species, not in the world and not in Mexico. And that's worrying. And also environmental change is projected to affect disproportionately tropical bat biodiversity, which is Mexico. And in one study I did in 2018 about how climate and land use change will affect the habitat suitability for Mexican bats, we projected that by 2050, more than 50% of the Mexican bats will lose habitat suitability all across the country. And here, for example, you can see in the maps, all the red areas in the left are going to lose habitat suitability for Mexican bats. And you can see some areas are quite bad, like the Yucatan Peninsula, across the Pacific coast, and here in the Baja California Peninsula as well. So yeah, it's also quite worrying what is projected to happen with bats due to the environmental changes in Mexico. And well, particularly bats have been highly persecuted and stigmatized because of Hollywood, Dracula, and unfortunately because of the bad reputation that the vampire bat has given to all the bats. And well, now the COVID pandemic, they also blame bats, and so bats now are having a really bad reputation, and people are vandalizing the roots, killing more bats, wiping out whole populations. So yeah, they are facing many problems, and we have to pay attention to them. Due to this situation that bats are very important to us in terms of pollination and other ecosystem services, and that they are facing a lot of threats, I wanted to focus on the question on how this particular interaction between bats and plants might be affected by environmental change here in Mexico. And to do so, I first focus on functional traits and how functional traits may provide vulnerability to some species or all the species. And well, first I want to say that functional traits are those physiological, phenological, or morphological characteristics of the species that allow them to respond or have an effect on their environments. And the anthropogenic impacts on the species depend also on the functional traits of the species. Yeah. Here we can see in the graph that functional traits provide fitness to the species, and also the functional traits will provide a function on the environment the species live. And in terms of bat traits, in the literature, the traits that have been identified to provide bats a particular function on the ecosystem and a particular vulnerability to any changes are geographic range, where species that are not widely distributed will be more affected by changes because the populations are smaller and they have less chances to escape those changes. Also, wing morphology is very important for bats because wing morphology, it's an evolutionary trait that allow species to exploit particular microhabitats and to fly within particular types of vegetation. Also, body size is very important. Well, large species tend to need more resources and they are more prone to extinction. This also happens for bats. And also reproductive rate is very important. And in general, bats do not have a very high reproductive rate. They reproduce once or twice every year, and they usually have one pup only. And rare species have up to 3, but that's it. They cannot have more pups. Yeah? So in general, bats also have a very low reproductive rate. For plants, well, they also have particular traits that make them respond differently to changes and have particular functions inside the ecosystems. Here, we have plant forms. You can see, for example, you have succulents, plant succulents, which are the cacti. You have rosulates, gametophytes, which are the agaves. You have succulent lianas. You have gametophytes, and you have the phanerophytes, which are the trees. So you can see that all these plant forms, they have different functions. You know, like trees cannot, you cannot have big trees in deserts, and you cannot have a lot of cacti in tropical areas. Right? Also, metabolism type is very important for plants. And I don't know if you hear about the different metabolism, which you have the C3 plants, the C4 metabolism, and the CAP metabolism. And this relates to the type of photorespiration that plants have. Photorespiration is a pathway that occurs when the Calvin cycle enzyme Rubisco acts on oxygen that is produced by capturing CO2 from the environment. And for example, for the C3 plants, this whole photosynthesis cycle is produced only in one particular cell of the plants. And it's a type of metabolism that is not very efficient in saving water, because everything is produced during the day and is produced only in one cell. So these plants are not very efficient in saving water. And this type of plants usually predominate in cooler habitats. And here in the picture, you can see some of the plants that are common with this metabolism. You have all the trees, have C3, you have wheat, you have rice. And then you have C4 plants. The difference is that they produce the photosynthesis in two different types of cells. This here, well, you can see a broad scheme of how this system works. Here, the CO2 enters in the mesophyll cell, and then the Calvin cycle is produced in a different type of cell, the bundle sheet cell, its name. These plants are more efficient in saving water because they can also close their stomata when they are at certain type of a certain process of the cycle. And this metabolism, the plants can save up to 40% of the water compared to the C3 plants. And a very few percentage of these plants have this metabolism. Only between 1 and 3% of all the plants worldwide have this metabolism. And corn and the sugarcane are typical plants with C4. And then you have the CAM metabolism, and it's named after the plants where it was found, from the Crassulaceae. This metabolism is typical of desertic plants. And it's one of the most efficient water-saving process. It can save 83% of the water, even more than C4 plants. And these plants save a lot of water because they divide the cycle between day and night. And during the night, when you have cooler temperatures and less water loss. And here on the right, you can see some of the plants typical with this metabolism. You have all the cacti, you have the agaves, Crassulaceae, and you can see these are typical of arid and very hot regions with not a lot of water. And even less plants have this metabolism, even less than the C4. So to do this research, first I gather occurrence data of all the Nectarivorous species in Mexico. All of these bats belong to the subfamily Glossophagidae, as I mentioned, and we have 12 species of pollinating bats in Mexico. I gathered the occurrence data from a previous paper that we published in 2018 and updated until 2020. So most of the occurrence data came from electronic repositories like GBIF and some local Mexican repositories like Nacional. To gather bat functional traits, we use the database named Pantheria, and we collected data on liters per year, which tells you about the reproductive rate of the different species. Also, we collected information about the diet breadth, which is the number of items from which the species feed from. Forearm length, which tells you the body, it's an approximation about body size. Also group size, which is the size of the populations or the gathering of the different species. And like I mentioned, for bats it's very important the wing shape, because it allows the different species exploit different microhabitats. So for wing shape, we use two different measurements, wing loading and wing aspect ratio. And here on the right, you can see the different shapes of the bat wings. So for example, species with a low aspect ratio are those species with short wings and broad wings like this one. And they usually are good for maneuvering inside vegetation. And then you have this type of wings that have a high aspect ratio, which are very long and narrow. And the species that have this particular type of wings, they are very good at saving energy and flying very long distances, like the migratory bats. And these type of wings are not very good at maneuvering inside vegetation. So this type of bats usually forage in open areas and are typical of desertic scrubland vegetation. We also collected plants. We collected plants occurrence data. And to do this, we first made a list of all the plant species that are visited or pollinated by bats, or that they show any chiropterophilic syndrome. And to do so, we look into the literature of all the studies across, in general, Latin America, not only in Mexico, that focus on plants that are visited by bats. And based on this list, we ended up with 126 plant species that somehow relate to bat pollination. We had four families, the Aspargaceae with 83 species, the Bromeliaceae with 10 species, Cactaceae 22, and Malvaceae with 11 species. And for these plant species, we look for occurrence data mainly in electronic repositories like GBIF, Conavio, and we clean this data to eliminate occurrence records with any obvious mistake on location, identification, etc. For the plant functional traits, we focus on plant life form and plant metabolism. And we assign all these to all these plant species to either of these two type of traits. And here on the table, you can see the combinations we have at the end. We didn't have any C4 plant. So this tells you that bats do not have any influence of visiting or pollinating any C4 plants, only cams and seed trees. And here you can see the families. For example, Aspargaceae, it had only cam metabolism. These agaves belong to this plant family. And the type of the line form is rosulate gametophyte. You can see here in the left. Bromelias, they have a C3 and cam metabolism, and they have this type of life form, rosulate gametophyte. The Cactaceae, or they only have one metabolism, cam, and they have two types of life forms, succulent lianas and succulent phanerophytes. Here in the right, you can see the columnar cacti. They have this shape. They are succulent phanerophytes, that type of tree, and cam metabolism. Then you have the Malvaceae family. They have C3. This family, Ceibas, belong to this family, and they have this type of life forms. Yeah. So we didn't have so many combinations. This also tells you that bats are very important for some particular families, some particular metabolism, and some particular life forms. For future and present environmental data, how we collected, I wanted to show you again this map of Mexico because it's important to understand how the vegetation, the ecosystem, and the climates are distributed in the country. We have a huge part of Mexico which is arid and semi-arid, and here you can see it in yellow. We have the desert, the scrublands, then we have grasslands. Going through the mountains, we have 3 big mountain ranges crossing the country here in the west. We have temperate forests here, a little bit on the east. Crossing in the middle of the country, we also have a huge mountain range, which is dominated by temperate forest. Then the tropical ecosystems, the rainforest, we have it all here a little bit in the south. And here in this part along the Pacific coast, we have deciduous forest. So this is important to remember when we go to the results. So because we have this huge range of vegetations and climates and ecosystems in Mexico, it's important to select the climatic variables that reflect this difference in Mexico. So for this, we selected 4 climatic variables. We download them from WorkClim at a resolution of 10 square kilometers. We use mean temperature of the warmest quarter, mean temperature of the coldest quarter, mean annual precipitation, and precipitation seasonality. Seasonality is very important in deciduous forest and also in desertic areas because you have some seasons that it rains and only a few months, and the rest of the year doesn't rain at all. So to understand also the climatic changes in Mexico, is very important to take into consideration the seasonality of precipitation. And for the land use cover, we used 4 covers obtained from the Robin project, also at a resolution of 10 square kilometers. We used forests, scrublands, grassland, and agriculture. And these were for the present and future variables. And for the future projections, we work on 2 different scenarios. One we call the optimistic, which is the RCP 2.6, which is sustainable heaven, which means that we actually lower our consumption of fossil fuels, and we tend to go towards a more sustainable, greener future. And then we use a pessimistic scenario, which is the RCP 8.5, which is the business as usual. We don't make any changes, and we just continue as we do. And we make the projections by 2050. For the distribution models for the bats, we use Bayesian's joint species distribution models. We use the climatic and the land use variables, but we also included the functional traits of the bats because we wanted to see how the functional traits of the bats were influenced by the climatic and the land use variables. But for the plants, we only build ensemble models with using 3 different algorithms, and we only include climatic and land use variables. For the plants, we didn't build a Bayesian joint model because we have so many species of plants, and it was computationally complicated to do this. So that's why we focus on bats, because we only work with 12 species. So it was manageable. And for the interactions between plants and the bats and how the distributions were going to shift in the future, well, we basically only estimated the difference in the overlap on the distribution of plants and bats in the present, and we compare them in the future. And that's how we approximate to interactions between plants and bats. For the results, here we found that for environmental change in Mexico, here in blue, we see the pessimistic scenario, and in red we see the optimistic scenario. With the pessimistic scenario, temperatures of the water are going to increase a lot. And also the coldest quarters, the temperatures are going to increase a lot in the pessimistic scenario. So we see that the projections for Mexico is a general increase in temperature for winter and for summer and for annual precipitation, we see that for the pessimistic scenario, we're gonna have lower precipitation in general. And in terms of seasonality, we see an increase in seasonality. And this is very important because if we increase the seasonality, it means that we're going to have probably a fewer rain, but it's going to be, how do you say, it's going to happen, the rain, in more drastic events. So you're going to have a lot of rain in very short times, and that's also that's bad for the plants and in general for the ecosystems, because it can destroy even some human habitats and the systems. And in terms of land cover, here we have also in red the pessimistic scenario. In yellowish, you have the optimistic, and in gray you have how the cover is in the present. And you can see, for example, that the forest in the pessimistic scenario is going to be reduced a lot. Shrublands are going to increase, and well, it makes sense if you're going to have less rain and it's going to be hotter. Grasslands are also going to increase in the pessimistic scenario. And interesting, it seems that the croplands are going to be more or less stable. So the cover that is going to be most affected is going to be the forest. Here you can see a distribution of the climatic variables in the present, how the climate is, in the optimistic and in the pessimistic scenario. Here you see the precipitation, the annual precipitation. And here in the pessimistic scenario, you can see that mostly in the tropical areas of Mexico, precipitation is going to be reduced a lot. Seasonality is going to increase in the desertic areas. Here, the mean temperature of the warmest quarter, well, in general, in the pessimistic scenario, temperatures are going to increase all over the country. And also temperature in the coldest quarter is going to increase all over the country. What is the effect or more, the response of bat traits based on the environmental variables we include? Well, here you can see in the graph, the coefficient means that the closer the trait is to zero, it means it's not influenced by the environmental variable. If it's above zero, it means it's affected positively by that variable. If it's below zero, it's affected negatively. Here you can see liters per year, diet breadth, forearm length, wing loading, and wing aspect ratio. And in the colors, you can see the different climatic variables. Well, just in general, you can see that climatic variables, like for example, mean temperature of the coldest quarter affects a lot the different traits. You can see the coefficients are quite large. Also, precipitation seasonality affects the different traits a lot. And land use variables, for example, here shrublands and croplands are very close to zero. So we found that in general, land use variables do not affect a lot the response pathways based on the distribution of the species. And here, this is the conclusion that traits have a high response over climatic and land use variables. And although we didn't check how particular species are going to be affected by climate change, we saw a general tendency that species with restricted distribution will lose already more distribution. And in general, we can see that bats will be challenged with higher temperatures and more drought. Here we can see how the traits are distributed across the country. Here in the left, you can see a mean adult forearm length. The darker the color means that species that are larger are distributed there. And you can see that larger species are more distributed again towards the north of the country, towards the desertic area. Current mean wing loading. Here also you can see that higher wing loading and higher aspect ratios are also distributed towards the north of the country and towards the desertic areas. What this means, higher wing loading and higher aspect ratio are the shape of the wings that are long and narrow. And again, these species are can move longer distances. Yeah? And they also tend to have larger geographic ranges. And in the south, we can see that you have a smaller species with lower wing aspect ratios. And these species are more adapted to particular microhabitat, which are humid, very restricted, with a lot of vegetation. And here you can see, so what I mean, no? These left species are the Nearctic wing type species, long, narrow. This Tadarida brasilensis, you have it also over there in the United States. It's a migratory bat. This Leptonicteris yerbabuena is also a migratory bat. You can see the shape of the wings. Compared to the neotropical species, you see they are more like, I don't know, like compact. They have very short wings and they don't move very long distances. So that is a very obvious trend. The traits are also very particular depending on the climate and the ecosystem type, the distribution. Also, for example, for current mean population size, you can see that in this Nearctic region, the northern areas have group sizes that are bigger. And litters per year, it's the opposite. You have species that have more litters per year in the south compared to the north. And the diet breadth, you also have a tendency that species with a higher diet breadth, a bigger diet breadth, are distributed also in the Nearctic regions. So you see a tendency that species that are smaller, that can move less over shorter distances, that are more specialized, are the neotropical bat species distributed mostly in the south of Mexico. So the projections for the bat richness, here in the left, you see the current bat richness. You can see also that in the tropical areas, we already have more pollinating bats than in the north. But the changes in the bat richness was not very steep. You didn't have many changes, neither in the optimistic or the pessimistic scenario. But the changes were focused also in these areas with the highest species richness, which kind of makes sense. And here in the lower part, you can see the percent of the national territory, how the richness is going to change. And you see that in the present, in this blue line, and the optimistic and pessimistic scenario pretty much looks the same, which this means that only 1 or 2 species are going to have their distribution shifts in either particular area of Mexico. So we conclude here that nectar bats, the pollinating bats, will not change the distribution a lot, nor the richness of the communities. And one explanation for this is that most of the bat species that we model are broadly distributed. As you can see here, well, you have we have pollinating bats all across the country. Yeah? So in this sense, these species are not going to affect it a lot based on the distributions. But the most affected areas are the ones with the highest richness already of species. And these areas are here, you can see these areas are going to be the most affected, which are the deciduous forests. And the deciduous forests are the ones that have the most richness of Chiropterophilous plants. So this is quite worryingly, because the areas that where the plants need most the bats are the areas that are going to lose more richness. The distributions are going to be shrink. Yeah. Here in this graph, I show you some general distribution changes for bats and plants. So the way to interpret this is this. The numbers inside the bars are the percentage of the country that are going to lose richness. Gray means that there is not going to be any change of richness. Blue, it means the area that are going to gain richness. And red means area that are going to lose richness. And very dark red means areas that are going to lose all the richness of this particular group of species. So for example, 21% of the territory in Mexico are going to lose richness of bats. 62 are not going to lose anything, and 17% of the area in Mexico are going to gain some richness. This is in the pessimistic scenario. But then, for example, for plants, 71% of the territory in Mexico are going to lose richness of Chiropterophilous plants, which is a lot. And then if we go, for example, to camp plants, 58% of the territory are going to lose richness in the pessimistic scenario. Or for example, for tea tree plants, 17% are going to completely lose all the species of tea tree plants. Can you imagine that? It's a lot. Or here, for example, the phanerophytes, which are the trees, are going to lose all the species of phanerophytes in 21% of the country and a reduced richness in 32%. So you can see that the numbers for the plants particularly are quite worrying. A lot of plants are going to lose richness or completely disappear, these plant groups, in a big area of Mexico. Yeah. Here also, there's another representation of the distributional changes of plants. The blue line is the present, the yellow is the optimistic, and red the pessimistic. You can see for the pessimistic that a huge percent of the national territory are going to lose species, is what we saw in the other graph. But also we found something interesting, that there are going to be altitude shifts. And I think this is also not surprising, because a lot of our previous research have found the same, that plant species and in general also animals tend to move towards cooler areas, which are the mountain tops at higher altitudes. And here we can see the changes in the mean altitude of the plants in the optimistic scenario and the pessimistic scenario. And we can see that it's going to be a shift towards higher altitudes. But what's the problem of moving towards higher altitudes? The mountain tops are a restricted area, no? It's not that they have a lot of territory they can move. So also the tendency is that if the plants move towards higher altitude, their distribution are also going to be restricted, because mountains are small areas also. And here is what we show in the lower graph, that the mean altitude is going to go higher, but also changing the area is going to be lower. It's going to be reduced. Here we can see the changes in the plant richness based on the different functional groups. I'm just gonna highlight a few. Here, for example, we can see the plant richness that is distributed towards the temperate areas, the mountain ranges, but the highest changes in the richness of plants is going to be towards the arid regions, where you already have low species of plants. And for example, for C3, you can see that some areas of Mexico are going to be completely wiped out of this type of plants. Here is a huge loss in some areas of temperate forest. For camps, we can see also that the north area of Mexico is going to be highly affected in reduced richness. Here, for example, I want to highlight the phanerophyte richness, that some areas that are quite rich are going to be to lose a lot of species. And for example, the rosulate cametophyte, which are the agaves, the higher richness is in arid and semi-arid regions. They are going to lose also a lot of species. And here also the succulent phanerophytes, which are the columnar cacti, are going to lose a lot of species in a lot of areas in Mexico. Yeah. And we can conclude from this that in general plants, we have a more drastic distributional and richness change than bats. And plants are projected to shift towards higher altitudes caused by range contractions. And while these shifts can be explained based also on the changes that I showed you at the beginning that are going to happen in Mexico, you're going to have droughts and you're going to be very high temperatures, and these plants are going to be looking for more humid areas that are cooler, which are the mountain tops. Camp plants are going to be highly affected. They are going to lose richness in more than 60% of the country. And if we think about camp plants, they already live in desertic areas which are at a threshold, a very sensitive threshold of temperature and water. So if these plants already have very few water and they're going to lose more water, this is worrying because maybe they will just collapse. And although bats didn't have any very drastic changes in richness or distributions, they will have a drastic change in the food sources. They are going to lose a lot of plant species from camps and from the C4 plants, from the C3, sorry. And for changes in interactions, this graph shows the pairs of plants and bats. And here for the pessimistic scenario, here we can see that a high percent of the territory are going to have fewer interactions due to environmental change. This means that bats are going to be interacting with much less plants. Well, here it's a graph also of the different interactions based on the different plant groups. I'm just going to focus on the camps, because these are the ones that are going to suffer more about interactions. So bats are going to lose a lot of camp plants from which they feed on. Yeah, and well, this is a complicated figure, but this shows pairs of all the bat species, and each line is a plant where they interact in the present and how the interaction is going to change in the optimistic scenario and the pessimistic scenario. Well, basically, a quick way to interpret this is when you see red, it means the bat is going to lose an area of interaction with a particular plant species. And the very dark red, it means that the bat is going to completely lose interaction with this particular species of plant. And for the pessimistic scenario, you can see a lot of red, which means bad. It means that these bat species are going to lose distribution, overlap with this particular plant species, and with this dark red, they are not going to have this interaction anymore. So they cannot feed anymore in the future from this plant, unless they move more. So yeah, this is in general, so you can also see that bats are going to lose a lot of interactions with plants in the optimistic and the pessimistic scenario. Here, although we did not consider phenology in this study, well, there is a general tendency of plants tend to flower earlier with higher temperatures. And migratory bats are going to be particularly affected on this because they base their migratory patterns based on the flowering of agaves and columnar cacti, which are the species that are going to be more affected. So we did not include phenology, but definitely this is also a point also. And there is a question that still remains unanswered, and how will this affect bat fitness? Because bats will definitely feed food sources, and not all the nectar from the different plants have the same content on protein or carbohydrates, etc. Then the same nutritional value. So some take-home points, general conclusions I'm going to give you is that environmental changes may cause an interruption, definitely, in the patterns of occurrence between pollinated bats and plants, and this will definitely affect the interactions. These alterations will differ depending on the metabolism and the life form of the plants. And also the response of the pollinating bats will depend on their functional traits, the ones we saw here. And the changes in the distribution of plant species that bat depends on may alter their function, such as pollination. And with this, I want to finish. Thank you very much for your attention. We still have good time for questions.
Dr. Zamora, thank you so much. That was really interesting. And I think you have provided a lot of information and context for understanding kind of your research program and what's going on with bats in Mexico. I'll remind folks, if you have questions, please add them to the Q&A tab that should be at the bottom of your screen. And I'm sorry,
I have to apologize for my English. It's been a while. I don't speak English for such a long time.
You did an excellent job. Thank you so much. And I'm going to read one of the questions out. This is a question from Dr. Barbara Hahn here at Cary. With the decline of plant richness, do you expect to see bats foraging on a different community of predominantly non-native or ornamental plants? And can you speculate about how these alternative food sources might influence changes in the bat distributions, especially those that are tracking seasonal food sources that vary across a large geographic range?
Wow, nice, very nice question. Well, bats are very plastic in general, and some nectarivorous bats from Glossophagine and Anura, they even change diets completely when there are no flowers. They turn to insectivory, and there are studies that they even have changes in the intestines, so they can benefit from the change of diet from nectar to insects. So I think some bats will adapt, definitely. Not only they will feed on different plant species, but they may even change to other completely food sources like insects. But not all nectarivorous bats have this this plasticity. You know, there are some species that are completely nectarivorous, and they have even longer snouts. And I think for this species, it's going to be very hard for them to adapt to the food sources. So they will just go extinct. But I think some of them definitely will change their distributions and diets. But how this will affect their fitness, that's something I don't know. Because like I said, like not all plants have the same nutritional value. And I think the plants we have in cities and parks, they don't have the same nutritional quality as those wild plants.
I have kind of a follow-up. So it seemed like one of the things that's happening is that plants will likely have to move up elevations. And are there elevations in those places that are conducive to the CAM plants moving up elevations, or is it likely that bats will be able to follow them? And I'm not sure exactly about the spatial alignment of where the elevations are and where the different more restricted kind of larger winged cactus loving bats are.
I'm going to put another map of Mexico. It's just important to consider the topography of Mexico to explain all of this. So the mountain ranges are here across the coast and covers the middle of the country and then this side. So plants will move towards these areas, and these areas are with the bats, with the wing morphology that can move long distances. Mm-hmm. So in these areas, I think bats will have the ability to follow the distributional changes of the plants. But like I said, like the mountain tops are not infinite. So plants cannot move and move and move more up. So eventually the ranges are also be very restricted, and I think bats will not have enough food. Even if the plants move, they will end up shrinking their populations even more. There's going to be definitely more competition between bats. The problem are the tropical bats. They have a specialized diet. They need dense vegetation to forage, and they cannot move long distance. So tropical bats are going to have a problem.
Okay, thank you. And do you talked a lot about changes in richness and the fact that maybe there weren't as many suspected changes of richness coming for bats, but Do you have a feel for where abundance fits in there? And are the abundances of the bats already declining in some of these places, or you have a plan to look at that scale of or that resolution of bat response to changing climate and land use?
Yeah, that's a question, an answer question. I definitely am monitoring cave-dwelling bats. The cave-dwelling bats are the ones with the bigger populations here in the north of Mexico. Most of them are cave-dwelling bats. We don't know if they are declining. We assume they are declining because of the mining and the vandalism and all of that. But there's something definitely we want to study in a bigger detail because we have no idea for sure what's happening.
Again, thank you so much. This has been really informative, and I look forward to having the opportunity to talk with you more later. There are getting lots of very positive, grateful chats coming through. And thank you everybody out there for joining us. We do hope to see you back next Thursday, and you can keep an eye on our website, and Dr. Zamora's talk will be available. And her information is also posted there if you would like to follow up. So with that, thank you. And Veronica, we'll see you in an hour for small group discussions.
Thank you.